Okay, so welcome everybody to the IM training series. Today we're going to be talking about statuses and workflows in Zeit Manager. And here are the chapters we'll be going over today. So we're going to talk a little bit about process design first and how this is different than maybe other work you've done in Kobo and ODK. So as opposed to a standalone form, and what I mean by that is a standalone form is sort of a form where after you're done, completing the form or submitting the form, the work itself is over, it's finished. You can consider it completed from the time that it's submitted. This is different than a process where we might have other actions that need to be taken as a result of that submission. So an example of this might be a construction project where we're doing the foundation assessment for a building. And once we do that assessment, there needs to be another step somewhere down the line. That step might be a later assessment of the infrastructure or the construction process, or site monitoring to make sure workers are using safety equipment appropriately. It can be anything, but basically it suggests that a form is not kind of completed, but rather an initiation or a continuation of some other piece of work. Now, what that work is, it can be a range of things. It might just be that something needs to be edited or reviewed by someone to check that it's correct. It could actually be, as I said, another submission needs to be made, or it could be like a task, maybe unrelated to data collection, that needs to be done. So, for example, someone reports that facilities are out of a certain type of equipment, or the generator is low on fuel. So someone then needs to go purchase fuel and refill the generator or refill our fuel stocks in an office or something like this. So in order to do this, we've kind of copied from the private sector when working in Zeit, and we've implemented a set of statuses. So you'll notice that every case that comes in by default will have a status. So it's a mandatory field in Zeit, and every case will have a status, even if the status is closed. So we have some default statuses. We have 5 that we're going to go through, and the status meanings can really mean whatever you want them to be. But generally speaking, we can assume certain meanings or certain implied meanings from the statuses we have. So for example, when something has the status open, generally speaking, we're understanding that to mean that it has some further action required, right? Usually open is a designation that something has just come into a process or starting a process. It may need to be reviewed, or something may need to happen to it in order for it to get to closed. And rather than going through sequentially, I'm going to jump to closed, because as opposed to open, closed has kind of a definite meaning of this doesn't require further action. This is done from a sort of data management perspective. We don't need to add data to it. We don't need to review it. We don't need to edit it. A closed case should ideally require no further action. That doesn't mean that we don't later go on and find maybe issues or corrections to make in closed tickets. But generally speaking, for the people who are actually moving work through a workflow or through a process, they don't need to be doing anything, or they've sort of considered it as finished. The other kind of intermediary statuses are more flexible in their definitions, and they might change depending on what you're doing in Zeit. Flagged is generally used to indicate something might require cleaning or review from the idea that it is wrong or something looks off with the case. So what that is really depends on your process. For example, in some of our processes, we will flag or ask Zeit to flag anything with open text entry. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that we want to make sure that we have someone looking at that open text, cleaning it, correcting it, if there's like spelling mistakes, or maybe it shouldn't be open text. Maybe there's like another way of recording that information in the form. So that's just one example of how you can use flagged. But flagging could be used for like someone reports very high values in a form, like saying 10,000 when we really think that probably the number should be in the 1,000. So, constraints are useful in preventing the user from entering a high number, but sometimes you can't always say a high number is, inappropriate. And in that case, flagging and reviewing submissions is a good way just to confirm things on the extremities of a situation are correct. In progress and responded, again, have very flexible meanings depending on what you're doing. Generally, we try and use in progress to indicate the case might be waiting for something or is pending another action. What that is really is again going to depend on the process and how you've designed it. Responded tends to mean that the case has a response from a reviewer and is waiting for some action before it's closed. So again, all of these definitions you see are pretty flexible and they're pretty abstract. And that's just to give you kind of tools or categories that you can bring your own meaning to when you create your own processes in Zeit. Alongside statuses, we also use something called tasks. Tasks are basically an assignment of work. They're always connected to a site, and they're also always connected to a user or a user role. It can be either, so you can assign something to me, Danny Coyle, specifically, or you can assign something to all the mobile users in a region or a site. However, a task is always related to a site. It's not related to a region, to be clear. So tasks can be either automatically created or manually created. So for example, you can have something created every week or every time something occurs, but you can also manually create a task. So I could manually say, hey, I'm in the office. I noticed the generator is low on fuel, and therefore I'm going to create a task reminding our procurement team to buy more fuel, for example, or to restock our fuel. Tasks also have their own status. So you have a task status that is different than the status of a case. Statuses are things like to do, meaning it needs to be done or completed. And we also have priorities, due dates, and assignments, right? These are all like kind of fields associated with tasks that you should be familiar with. And I think we've just talked about these. So yeah, these are what we would call like the properties of the fields associated with a task. There's different types of tasks, and I think they're worthwhile going through because, as I said, some of them are manually created, some of them are automatically created. A general task type means like it really can be anything. The only rule for a general task is that it has to have a description. So this example of needing to refill fuel for the generator, that would be a good example of just a general task. And it generally implies something that's not Zeit related. Because for example, if we want the user to do something in Zeit, we have other task types that are more specific that kind of describe that. So for example, a submit task will say, hey, please submit a specific form. So for example, if we have a form that needs to be completed every week, it's like a weekly checklist for our office to make sure we have all the supplies. We would have maybe a weekly checklist form, and we could set up a task that says submit this form every week. Example would be another site monitoring form. We need to do that every month. So you could say, hey, I want to set up a reoccurring submit task to remind my team members to submit the site monitoring form once a month. Review and refer tasks are created when open cases come in. So when a case comes in, if it has the open status, it will be marked for review, which means someone needs to look at this. They need to do something with it. At bare minimum, they ideally need to change the status from open to closed. But they might need to do other things. They might need to edit it, add a comment, add a reason, do the kind of basic case review process that we've described. Another task type could be review site. This happens, we haven't talked much about this feature. This happens when new users or users create a new site or edit a site, and that needs to be reviewed before that change is finalized. So reviewing sites is something IMs will often do. So for example, if you do work in a project that has many sites, hundreds of sites, obviously you don't want to be the only person who is allowed to add sites on the site list, but you maybe want to be part of that review process. So we talked a lot about how sites should be properly coded, but that coding of sites is often the responsibility of an information manager. It's not necessarily the responsibility of like a field staff or someone who's discovered a site. So for example, they may add a site to your list, and then you as the site reviewer might actually code it correctly and just check to make sure like the GeoPoint information and other information related to that site is correct. Lastly, we have a follow-up task. This implies that there's a second form that needs to be connected to the case submitted as a follow-up. So in my example of I made a building, I did a foundation assessment. The following step is we're gonna, assess the superstructure. That would be a follow-up form. So you might have 3 forms for your building, your foundation, your superstructure, and then like a completion form. So that was originally Zeit's design actually in Nepal was doing that process as part of the government reconstruction program. However, again, you can use it for things like referrals. Hey, we opened a referral, we need to close the feedback loop. That would be done through a follow-up task where you can connect the closure of the referral or the follow-up of the referral to the opening of the referral. Okay, I'm going to show you a little bit about tasks and how they look in Zeit Manager as part of this. So here we're starting off on our project dashboard, and you'll see here that there's a task tab in this project, and you'll see that there are currently 1 task. And you'll see if I can click this and see the information that I shared with you that goes with every task. And you'll see that it has things like a priority, it has a due date, it says what task type it is, and you'll see like who it's assigned to. So this task is assigned to any reviewer in the project. And you'll also see things like the site it's associated with. So it would be listed here somewhere. Actually, it doesn't say assigned site. Yeah. So this is the site that it's been assigned to. You'll also be able to see like kind of the case history, and tasks also have a task history. So for example, if I'm unable to do this task, I could equally add a comment saying, I can't do this until next Monday, for a reason listed here. And this is, again, a way just for team members to communicate and coordinate work. Oftentimes, right, you'll have 3 people maybe working in the same site. And it can help to say, hey, I'm going to do this, but I can't do it now, so that my other team members are not trying to do it alongside me or at the same time. Okay, so I'm going to close this out, but I'm going to also show you how to create a task. So to create a task manually, you can go create task, and you'll see here that you just need to fill out the required information. Some is pre-populated, like the project, but you can say here like refill generators with fuel, right? And here I can give the task general. So manual tasks, you'll see I can only make a general or a submit. The other task types happen automatically, and they're set up through different scheduling systems. So you can add a description of how much fuel to use or to refill. And then again, I can say what site I want that for. I can say the task is to do or in progress. Like maybe I've already started this and I'm just telling people that it's in the works. And you'll see here I can assign either to a role, right? So I can say I want any reviewer to do this, or I want any mobile user to do this. I can also say, hey, I want specifically manager 2, for example. We don't have many users in this project. I could ask manager 2 to do it. For now, I'm just going to say I want any reviewer to do it. And then I'm going to pick a date. So this is the date I want the task to be completed by, let's say next Friday. And then I can give it a priority. So this is very high priority. You'll notice I can also schedule this task. So if this is something I want to be done every week, right? You can see that I can say, okay, we need to do this for the next 10 times, like the next 10 weeks, we need this done. And you'll see how often. So maybe I only want it once every 7 days. I want this task to be scheduled. So again, useful little like team management tool. Generally speaking, we are not using so much the manual task creation, just simply because our projects are often at a high scale, but there's nothing preventing you from using them. When we created the automatic task feature, it was something easy to do alongside. I would say probably manual tasks are more useful in smaller team environments. But they work at any scale, and they're just like a part of your project. You'll see that you kind of, this record has now already updated, and you can find your task list also connected to a particular site. So if I come into this site, you'll notice that I have a task tab here as well. And this will allow me to see tasks associated with this site particularly. So that's the task feature as we have it in Zeit. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how to actually use statuses, tasks to create this sort of process flow, right? Because Zeit doesn't know your process. You need to know your process going into it. And then you need to use Zeit to make that process more automated and to kind of flow seamlessly through a certain, given SOP or given, set of steps that you want it to take. So really what we're doing here is automating work. We're automating requesting users to do certain things. And Zeit is also going to be able to help you by automating just some data management on its own. And I'll explain that in a moment. So this something to know about the workflow feature in Zeit, which is how we refer to our automations, is that they're always connected to a form. So we don't really have workflows outside of a given form, and all your workflows need to be attached to a given form. Workflows are best understood by their types. So for example, if I want the status of a case to change when something is true, right? Then I would use the change status workflow. So workflows are best understood in this process, and that's kind of how we're going to go about discussing them today. Why might you want to use a workflow? So a lot of times people don't use this feature in Zeit, and generally speaking, it's totally acceptable. If you don't need workflows, you don't have to use them. But as I said, Zeit, as we've said in earlier training, Zeit is designed around process automation and operations data. And a lot of operations data is living data, as we discussed. It's data that comes in, needs to be reviewed, needs to be shared, managed, edited before we can consider it closed. And so really how we do that at scale is we use workflows to really like save time and to make it such that every time something comes in, it's not that I, the manager, has to go through every single thing and review it one by one. Sometimes I have to do that for my process, but many times I can say, every time the foundation is marked as okay or has no safety issues, I don't need to review that. I only maybe need to review my foundation form when there's an identified problem or a safety issue related to that building. And so this is how workflows can step in and help us by saying, in these cases, we don't need to review something. In these cases, we do. Workflows also really help us ensure data accuracy. So they can really help us stay on top of our data. As you imagine that if you're running a project for a year and you have thousands of submissions coming in every week, workflows can help remind us and help us kind of either escalate certain data saying, hey, you need to review this. It's been sitting there for 6 months. You don't let it sit there forever, or it can even help you close out really old data. It can say, hey, it's been there for 6 months. We're not going to be dealing with it. So I'm going to move it to closed on my own, meaning Zeit. Workflows are also helpful in enforcing standards or SOPs. So if we say in a process like, hey, we should only do the second form after the first form is completed, the workflow process really helps that happen, right? Because we're basically making it such that you could never do superstructure assessment on a building unless you've first done the foundation assessment. And so in this way, workflows are really useful in ensuring our teams are doing things as we want them to happen in our given process flow. So how do workflows work, generally speaking? So all workflows work on what we call Boolean logic or if-then logic. So if-then logic means if something is true, then do this. And that's kind of like very common in IAM. I'm sure many of you have seen if-then or Boolean logic in the past. If it can be different things, right? If might be based on time. So if 10 days has passed, if might also be something in the form itself. So you could say, if this is a foundation assessment and there are no safety issues, then do something, right? And different types of workflows are based on different like actions. So as I said, the then is sort of determined by the workflow type, and the if has a set of criteria that we're going to discuss probably on the next slide. Okay, so before we start actually making workflows, though, it's often useful to map out what you want to have happen and this if-then logic, because if you don't know, what should happen when, you're not going to have an easy time implementing your workflows, and things are going to get very confusing very fast. So a tool we often use is this app.diagrams.net. It's a free diagram tool. It's really easy to use, and we're going to show you some of the diagrams we've made with it in a moment. But the idea here is to really get you to draw out visually the steps that you want to have happen and sort of the requirements along the way, that sort of if-then logic. Because as you map this out, you'll notice you sort of end up with a sort of spider web or a process flow where certain things are happening in some cases and not in the other. And it's good to really consider that whole process before you implement it, because what can happen is that you end up with things stuck in certain locations, or, things don't, go necessarily where you might want them to go, or things happen when you don't want them to happen. So in order to do this, we make diagrams like this. We're going to go through our 3 use cases that we talked about. So activity reporting, referrals, and site monitoring. And we're going to show you how we might diagram out a process flow for each of these. So for example, my activity report, and you'll notice this legend at the bottom says kind of what the blocks mean on the diagram. So, if someone submits an activity report, is how I've set this up. And then there's a branch, which means there's a decision point. 2 things could happen. One could be if the achieved is larger than 100, I want my workflow to change the status to flagged, because that's going to allow me to review and possibly correct, if that person has done this incorrectly, the submission before I mark it as closed. The other case is if it's under 100, I'm going to assume that the team has done it correctly, and it's going to move automatically to closed. So this is, again, a really simple diagram, but showing you how everything, from the activity report coming in should end up as closed. But, as I said, sometimes there's extra steps in the middle. And those extra steps are when, if someone said, I've done a training for 150 people, that sounds a bit strange to me as a manager. I want to know how you trained 150 people. That sounds too much. Maybe our rules say you should only be training 40 people at a time. So this is, again, sort of a silly example, but one example of how you might have this sort of flexible logic, right? So the person can still say they trained 150 people, but if they do that, I'm using Zeit to help me review and sort of check that data. As an assistant almost. Okay, so for our monitoring form, again, monitoring forms are generally standalone forms. And by that, I mean, like, once you submit the monitoring, we sort of assume it's done. But in this case, I've added some workflows to it. So the monitoring form will always go to close. So no matter what happens, it's going to come in, it's going to go to close, and I'm going to set that using the form default. However, there's maybe some other stuff I want to have happen. So one is that if the site status in the form is inactive, so in my monitoring form, maybe I have a question where the question says, is the site still active? And the options are active or inactive. So if I say it's inactive, I'm going to use a workflow to update my site information field from active to inactive. This is a good way, again, to make sure things like your site list matches what your users are submitting in relation to that site. Similarly, maybe in the monitoring questions, I have a question called, are any of the fire extinguishers expired? And if someone says, yes, some of the fire extinguishers are expired, I want to create a task that reminds users to replace or refill the fire extinguishers. So this is, again, a good example of how you can use this sort of dynamically to just help different things or remind your users what they should be doing when certain things occur. Because you might have managed, I did the monitoring, it's been a long day, I come back, I submit the form, but I forget, right? I might forget to update the site status, or I might forget that now I also need to replace the fire extinguishers in the site if they're expired. So this is a good way of showing you how you can tie sort of different pieces of data in your project together just through your forms. The last one is the most complicated. So referral systems get really complicated simply because there's a lot of different things that are happening in a referral. Certain things are referred, certain things are rejected, right? Certain things like are not referred. So for example, here, what I've implemented is when a referral form comes in, everything is marked as open, but certain things are going to go straight to close. So for example, certain things we don't refer. If someone says, hey, I would like to get a second NFI kit, we know that they're not going to get a second NFI kit because it's one per household. So we can tell them on the spot, and really we're just recording that someone has asked for a second NFI kit. So in that case, that top line says when initial status is closed, it will then close the form. So in that case, we're not really doing a referral. However, most of the time we are doing a referral. So you'll see that Zeit puts everything into open, and then a reviewer would go maybe share the data with the responsible parties. Maybe the responsible parties are logging into Zeit, seeing, hey, there's, in this case, let's say a wash referral for us to respond to. And then they might do one of two things, right? They might mark the case as in progress. Maybe in order to deal with the wash issue, they need, to do a technical assessment, and they can use the in progress status as a way to show that. And they can also then mark it as responded, meaning, hey, it's ready for follow-up. So when something is marked as responded, you'll see I have an arrow to a workflow that will trigger a completion report. So this is a follow-up workflow that is going to basically ask the team to make another submission. For those of you who've done CFM with us or referral systems for us, this is a very common common process or common kind of workflow that we're using to kind of both trigger a referral and then wrap up the referral at the end of the day. And you'll see that when that second submission, that completion report is submitted, the form will then go to closed. Okay, so those are my workflows, and I just thought it might be useful to see first, before we continue, what does it look like to actually set up a workflow? What does the interface look like, and what sort of options we have? So we're going to go through that quickly, and then we're going to revisit this to talk about the different types of workflow and how you can use them. Okay, so I find my workflows, as I said, they're attached to forms. So we go to Site Forms, and you'll see here that there are workflows associated here. If there's no workflow, it'll suggest that you can add one. And if you do have workflows added, you'll see that they are added here and that you can toggle them on and off if for some reason you want to easily deactivate them without fully removing them. Okay, so I'm going to add one of the ones we discussed to our monitoring form. So I want to change the status of the site, not the case, but the site, when the form is set, or when the person marks in the form that it's inactive. So I can say change site status when site is inactive, right? This description will appear in the case history. So it's important that it does make sense. You know, you can give some short message, but it's good that the message actually suggests or explains what has happened. And you'll notice I have here options for when the workflow should trigger. So I want this to happen as soon as the case comes in. I don't want it to happen after a certain time. And then I can say here, okay, here are the questions in my form, my monitoring form. And you'll notice one of my questions is the site active or has it closed? So I can say, okay, when it's inactive, is when I want this to happen. So this is the sort of if criteria. So if this is true, then I want the site status to change. And you'll see here I can hit continue and it'll say, okay, what do you want to change the site status to? I want to change it to inactive. I don't want to add a reason. I don't want to add a comment. You know, if I did, I would say the monitoring, you know, reported that the site was inactive. So this would then also like add a comment to the case, letting me know that this action was automated. And then at the end, you'll see a preview that says, okay, this is your logic. If this is true, then do these things. And then I'll create this. And you'll see here now it's added. So now anytime someone submits a monitoring form, if the monitoring marks the site as inactive, the site status will also be updated to be inactive. And it's that simple to create workflows. They're really flexible. They don't take long to set up. What does take a long time, though, as I said, is really understanding what you want to have happen and how that relates to a larger process in your program. So if your mind is very clear, if your SOP is very clear, implementing workflows is pretty easy. It's not like a laborious task. However, it's often the case that understanding like what do you want to have happen when, that often takes a lot of discussion and a lot of coordination with your team, because your team also probably needs to know that, hey, if they mark it as inactive, they don't need to change the status because the Zeit platform is going to be doing that itself. Cool. Okay, so we took a quick look at all those settings. I wanted it to be familiar to you, but I'm going to go now more in depth and talk about the detailed options each of those have. And then we're going to talk about the types of workflow, like the then sort of what you can make happen using the workflow feature. So when we talk about triggers, trigger is sort of like, when do you want this to occur? And you basically have three options here. You have one which is called on submission, which means immediately. So as soon as Zeit receives a submission, within probably an hour, it's going to try and run whatever workflows associated with it. It won't necessarily happen within the span of like 1 minute or 30 seconds, just because if the server is very busy, the workflows will run whenever there's server capacity, basically. So immediately doesn't mean like within 15 seconds. Immediately can mean to be like, 30, 45 minutes after something is submitted, but generally it will try and do it as soon as it has capacity. The other option you have is after time. And if I had selected that, I can pick any number of days after which I want the workflow to run. So for example, I might leave a referral open for 2 months, but then after 2 months, I might say, you know what, this referral after 2 months, I can't really refer it anymore. And I'm going to close it and just say that we couldn't fix it. We didn't receive a response. So kind of delayed triggers are useful in sort of managing data that gets old or managing data that might otherwise have been stuck or forgotten about. This is very common in projects that have a lot of data and a lot of submissions. It's a nice thought to think that we have enough capacity to review everything. The reality is we often don't. And so these sort of delayed submissions are quite useful in reminding people or even just sunsetting data, we could say. The third option you have as a trigger is when the status changes to. So this is useful for when, so if someone marks something as responded, then we want the follow-up to happen. This is that sort of trigger we would use. We would say, when the status is responded, then I want my team to follow up and close the feedback loop to close out that referral. This is how we would use that option as well. So you have those 3 trigger settings. Most of the time we're using on submission, but you may use the other 2 in certain instances. The second main thing you need to decide as part of your sort of if logic is the criteria. So when do you want this workflow to run? Now you can say, I want this to run every single time. Doesn't matter what's in the form. It should always run. And that's valid. You want that to happen sometimes. Other times, as I said, you only want the form to close when it's something we can't refer, or I want the status, right, to be made inactive only if the site is inactive, right? And in this, you saw that interface that allowed me to say, when this value in the form is selected, then take this action on the case. So when the referral is MHPSS, mark it as in progress because the MHPSS team is going to follow up on that immediately. Or when the activity is community awareness session, mark it as closed because we don't need to review those things. Okay, so triggers, I think we talked mostly about this. And yeah, as I said, you have these 3 main options to go through. When you use them is, as I said, a little bit a part of your diagram and what you're trying to do and achieve. But basically, your 2 options are immediate or after something happens. So that could be a time delay or a change to the status. And then with criteria, we didn't go over this. You can select any field or data type in the form, but your options are going to change depending on what ODK question type you're using. So for select questions, you can choose the choices. But for integers, you might need to give a specific value. For calculate types, you have to give a specific value. So you can set workflows off calculate type questions, but you have to say when this calculated value equals open, for example, then you want something to happen. If you want something to happen always, there's a toggle at the bottom that we'll show you at the end that says apply to all cases. This means you always want the workflow to run. Doesn't matter what's selected. It should just always run. If you have multiple criteria, meaning if you have 2 or 3 or more questions that you want to string together, you can do that. And it can be either and or logic. So when activity equals MHPSS or activity equals community focus group discussion, then do this. That's okay. Just keep in mind, this is where mapping that out in advance is really important because and or logic can get confusing in terms of overlapping criteria. Sometimes you can create criteria that will never evaluate as true, right? So for example, if I said, community activity is focus group discussion and the value of this other field should be something, but that field is then skipped in the form, it would never evaluate as true, and therefore the workflow would never run. Cool. Any questions on the if logic that we use in workflows?
I don't see any questions yet.
Great. Okay, so in terms of workflow types and settings, this is sort of what action will happen when where criteria are met and when the trigger is met. So the type determines what happens, and this is the most important thing to kind of think about when you're diagramming out your processes and you're thinking about what you want to have happen. Associated with the types are some settings. I showed you on the screen, right? It wasn't just change status and you can only change things to one status. The setting allowed me to change the status to any of my site statuses that I had set up in my project. And also, like a very common thing is that you'll see that we always allow a reason and a type to be set as a part of any workflow. So you can always like add a comment, sorry, not type, comment. You can always add a comment as a part of any workflow process. This is, I would say, a good thing to do because it's helpful in the case history page to go back and say, hey, this closed. Why did it close? Oh, it was because a workflow is set up to close it after 30 days of inactivity or something like this. Okay, so we're going to go through the workflow types now, one by one, and talk about what they do and what settings are available. So the first workflow type is pretty straightforward. It's called change case status. And what this will do is it will change this case status to any of those 5 statuses that we talked about at the beginning of the training based on those criteria. And this is quite useful for when you have like a branching process, right? Sometimes things get flagged and need to be reviewed. Sometimes they get marked as in progress. Sometimes they go straight to close. So change case status allows you to say, hey, we want this case to come in as open, but then from there, it's going to go to different locations depending on the criteria that we want. As part of settings, you get to say what status you want to have set. You have the comment and the reason, and then you can also say, I want to close the tasks associated with this. So for example, if you know, when something comes in as open, Zeit will automatically create a review task. But if you're saying like, hey, actually, these things we don't need to review, you might want to mark that close associated tasks button just so that it closes out the review task automatically when it closes the case. Change site status. We showed you that one just a moment ago. And that will change the site status. So not the case status, but the site that the case is located in to the value. This is quite useful, as I said, for things like your monitoring form, and it allows you to use the site status more flexibly. Like you could have a site that says needs urgent action, right? And so you could have your site list updating with more than just active, inactive, but you could have them updating with things like in progress or, you know, priority site, however you want to imagine that usage. It can now be tied to cases. And so as data comes in, your site list can be updating with kind of more dynamic statuses. For the settings, you just need to say what site status you want, and then the comment and the reason are there optionally. Create task will allow you to create a task. So that task creation screen that I showed you at the earlier, you know, part of this lesson is going to be available to you through the workflow interface. So first you would again set up your criteria, and then you'll say, okay, what's the task you want to create? What, you know, who do you want to assign that to? What's the due date, the priority, all of that information. And this basically allows you to do things like, hey, when someone says there are no fire extinguishers, create a task to refill fire extinguishers for that site, because we have funding for that. That's part of our responsibilities. And, you know, as I said, you can have that assigned to the same team, or maybe you have like a special procurement team that you want to assign that to. Again, your options here are, you have to set up more settings because you have to say what sort of task you want to create. And you can also say whether you want that to be scheduled. So maybe this is like a repeat task that is now reoccurring as a part of this. Hide. So hide's a funny one, and it doesn't necessarily have an obvious use case, but hide allows us to hide certain data from users that would otherwise have access to it. And this is useful when we might have sensitive information coming in that we want users to still record that information, but we don't want necessarily to have to give it to have access to it. So what hide does is it will remove view access and even edit access from people with certain roles. It doesn't remove the case data. So the data is still available for export. It is still like retrievable, but it will not show on the site dashboard. It will not also sync to the mobile application when we talk about that. So if I submitted something like a protection referral, you know, even if I don't have someone's name in that, I don't want people seeing how many protection referrals occurred where. So I can use this function to sort of hide that information from people who shouldn't have access to it, or I just don't want to highlight that information. So as part of the settings here, you can say which users specifically you want to hide it from. But more broadly, you could say we want to hide it from anyone who's a mobile user or a viewer, even certain managers can be, have things hidden from them. Generally speaking, we're using this, as I said, to hide more sensitive data that we just, wouldn't want to have more widely accessible. Tags. Tags is a feature I think we've talked a bit about. Tags are sort of allowing us to categorize cases based on some other values. So for example, if you have referrals, you probably want to organize your referrals by the sector or maybe even the agency we're referring to. So you might have a tag called WASH and you might have a tag called IOM, right? And that just allows you to more easily sort and filter cases in your dashboard, in your mobile application, even in data exports, you can use it that way if that's how you want it. And so what tag will do is no one wants to go through and say, oh, this was MHPSS. We need to tag this as MHPSS, or this was WASH. I'm going to tag it as WASH. You can add tags manually, of course, but generally speaking, we're more often using the tag workflow to say, hey, this is a referral. Please add a tag based on what sector was given in the sector field. So again, settings can be always tag this as a monitoring form, or it could be use this value as a tag. So the value of the referral sector should be the value of the tag. Again, you can also add reason and comments optionally. The replace workflow is a little bit similar to the hide workflow. It's a privacy feature. Now, what it allows us to do is remove data over time. And I say remove because it's really important in that it will erase data and replace it with something else. And we do this for privacy reasons, because as I said, when working with living data, especially over long periods of time, sort of your ODK database ends up becoming quite a large data repository of personal information. And there's usually some ethics surrounding that in terms of how long we should be keeping data and whether we should even be keeping personal data if we're not needing it. What this allows us to do is rather than delete the entire record, so, we still want to know that we made a referral last year, but I don't need to know anymore who it was to, their ID number, their phone number. And so the replace workflow allows us to say, hey, after 180 days, please delete certain fields of data from the form. And when I say delete, it is removed, so we can't retrieve it. And that allows us, as I said, to kind of maintain privacy and to actually do a better consent process. So we can tell people now in our forms, in our processes, hey, we're going to record your personal information, but we're only going to record it for 180 days. The settings for this are actually a lot more nuanced. So you can say which statuses this should happen to. So for example, you probably don't want to erase data from an open case because that means you're still working on it. So you can say, only erase data when the status is closed and only after it's been closed for 180 days, for example, or 30 days or 60 days, whatever it is you want to set. You get to pick the fields you want to erase. So as I said, very often we're not erasing anonymous information. Like it's fine to have that it was a WASH referral for a very long period of time. It's not okay for us to know the ID number of that person though. So we can say only remove their ID number, their phone number, their name. And then we can also say what we want to put in its place. So you can leave it, you can have Zeit change all that data to blank, but sometimes it's helpful to just indicate, hey, the workflow removed this data. So we'll often add text that says remove or removed. And we know that means that this workflow changed the data there. And then also, obviously, you can add a reason and a comment, and that's always really good because, as I said, if you're ever going back and reviewing historical data and data is missing, it's helpful to know if someone has removed that data, especially as part of an automatic process. Refer is a funny one because as you may have learned in the user management lesson that Harris gave, many times you'll have access to cases or to data as part of your user permissions. So if you are a reviewer for a site, it means that you will by nature of your reviewer role have access to see what is on the site dashboard, the cases that have come in, unless it's been hidden from you, obviously, or unless that data has been removed. Refer workflows allow us, though, to create a little bit more granularity in terms of who should be seeing what. So for example, let's say we want our MHPSS colleagues to be able to log in to Zeit go into a site and see MHPSS referrals. But in that project space, we have monitoring forms, activity reports. We also have referrals for, let's say, WASH or Shelter NFI, and they really don't need to see all that data. So using the refer workflow, what we can do is we can refer cases to use a reviewer focal area. So in this case, I would create a reviewer focal area for MHPSS, and then using the refer workflow, I would send them only tickets that met those criteria. So this is a bit more complicated. As I said, it requires a few steps. One is to create the reviewer focal area, which is something that you can do very quickly. And then the second step would be to set up a workflow that sends them tickets that match MHPSS, so whatever it is they need to see. Focal areas don't have access to anything in and of themselves. So just creating an MHPSS focal area does nothing. That person or a person with that user like permission wouldn't see anything unless and until I started referring things either to them using like the manual refer feature or using this automated workflow. As part of this, you get some cool settings as well. So if you want that MHPSS team to receive an email notification every time there is a review or a referral to them, you can have it such that they also get an email in their inbox that says, hey, you've received a referral. We suggest you exercise this with caution, namely because Zeit will send an email per case. So if you have a lot of referrals, it's not a great idea to set up a refer workflow because they will receive an email for each and every case that comes in. Optionally, you can also customize some of the referral tasks that's created. So a refer task is created through this workflow, and you can explain what you want the person to do there. Because again, a lot of times we're using this with people who are less familiar with Zeit or having more specific rules in Zeit. So it's helpful to give them more specific instructions. I think the last but not least workflow is group. Grouping logic is when we want two cases to sort of be linked into one. And it can be useful in reducing the amount of duplication you have in submissions. For example, if I come and I ask site management to open a referral for me because I didn't receive Shelter NFI assistance and I really need it. So the next day I go and I ask for Shelter NFI assistance. You know, I've technically made two referrals. Let's say I want to speak to two different people in the same site. You know, that actually is not great because basically then we've opened two referrals for what is essentially the same problem. So the group workflow allows us to say, hey, under certain criteria, basically when certain things are the same, please merge those together. The way Zeit does that is it takes the first case as the case ID and it sort of links the second case to the first case. This will always run immediately, so you can't say do this after 10 days. But it can be quite useful in certain instances, and especially if you're seeing a lot of duplicate submissions. Use with caution because, you know, as I said, you have to think, you know, what you are grouping. So for example, you could say group all the MHPSS referrals together, but you have to be aware that they might be for different people. And if you want to manage those referrals separately, then you shouldn't be grouping them. You would want to, you know, have them as separate cases. So only group what you ideally want grouped together. Okay, so that was, again, a lot of workflow types. I don't expect you all to understand and remember that in your head. That's why we have this lesson that will be recorded. And that's also why we have guidance documents. But let's take a look at more of these workflows and how to set them up. Cool. So starting on our service referral, you'll see here I have a lot of the workflows that we've gone over, and we're just going to check out some of them to become more familiar with how this feature works and what the settings look like. So the first one here I have on my list is close on the spot. This is for that case that I said when we're not going to refer everything. Some things we're going to close immediately because we know we can't refer them. So I've named this workflow close on the spot. The type is to change the case status, and the trigger is on submission receive. You'll see here the initial status is closed. this is the button that I said, if I toggle this on, it actually means that this workflow would run all the time. So it would close everything if I left this on. But in our case, we actually only want this for when the initial status is equal to closed. And you'll notice that it's not giving me a choice list here. That's because this is not like a select one or a select multiple type question. This is actually a calculated field. So this is case sensitive. If I were to type lowercase c, it would not work. It would not run unless that was what was set in the form. You'll see here, I want to close all the tasks associated with this because I'm closing out the case. And you'll notice that it gives me a preview and then I can save. So again, that is one of the easiest workflows. This is also one of the ones that we will have multiple close status or change case status workflows on a form many times. We will also, yeah, this is the most common and often best one to use. Let's take a look at referrals, because this one is a bit more difficult. So if you'll notice in my user section, under focal areas, I have two focal areas, one for protection, one for shelter. So first I need to create these first. So for example, you know, I need to add MHPSS here if I want to set up for MHPSS. This currently has no tickets associated with it, though. It has no cases. This person or this user would not be able to see anything until I went into here and I manually added a refer workflow. So this is refer to protection. Let's add one to refer to MHPSS. And you'll notice I have to set that up as a separate workflow because it's a separate role. And so here I will say workflow type, refer, when the submission comes in. And you'll see I can say cluster, I can say MHPSS. So this is only for MHPSS cases. So when the cluster is MHPSS. And then here you'll see I have the task settings related to the referral. So I can say, you know, referral, MHPSS referral. And then I can say, you know, please advise on whether the program can support this person. To do, I want to know, you know, in the next 7 days from the MHPSS team, it's medium priority. That's fine. I can say, okay, here, this is where I would actually say this should only go to the MHPSS focal area. Right now, we don't have any cases that have come in, but when I select this, they would start receiving cases whenever this workflow runs for their relative case. And again, I can have them optionally receive an email. I can set up a reason and a comment priority as well. Continue, create. And now I have, you'll notice it doesn't get added to the list until I hit refresh. But once I hit refresh, I should be able to see my refer to MHPSS cases. Let's look at replace data. I think this one is also really important to look at. You'll notice here I have removed personal data. This is happening after 60 days, which sounds good to me. It's going to apply to everything, right? There's never a case when I don't want to remove personal data after 60 days. Obviously, if you have situations like that, you can make criteria, but generally speaking, we're doing this as a general rule. You'll see here the status. I only want this to happen on closed cases. So if the case is still open after 60 days, this would not happen. And you'll notice in my referral form, I'm collecting the person's name and I'm collecting their phone number. And this is where I choose those fields to be removed. And you can say I can replace it with a null value, which just means like leave it blank. But it's much better to usually say removed. And then if I see this text in my data exports, I know that, hey, it's because the workflow ran and it removed this. And again, it's great to include a comment saying personal data has been removed. So when it runs, it will add that comment. Okay, save. That one's set up. Let's also look at tag by sector, because this is like, let's say a utility one. It's not really going to move your data through a process, but it's going to help you navigate your data. So this says tag by sector when the data comes in. It's going to apply to everything. So we always want the sector tag to be applied. And you'll see here, rather than say like when sector equals shelter, give the shelter tag, I can just say tag from the questions cluster. This means that whatever the value cluster is, it will be added to as a tag. So if I go continue and hit save, that should run. It's always important to test your workflows. So as I said, Sometimes they don't trigger like right away. And for things like removing personal data, if you set 60 days, you wouldn't really be able to check until after 60 days. But oftentimes it's better to set up your process, run it in a test site, see the workflows are running correctly, like chase your data through the different trees of your process diagram to really make sure everything is connected and configured correctly. As I said, this is connected to your form. So if you have errors in your form or logical, like, issues, like I use closed with a lowercase c instead of a capital C, that will mess up your workflow. And that's what we're going to talk about now. But before we do that, do we have any questions?
No, no questions.
Great. Okay, so to close out this session.
I see a question.
Great.
Just popped up. Canessa asks, could you please quickly repeat how to create a referral focal point for automated referrals?
Yeah, we're going to wrap up the session and then I'm going to cover that again. And we can also like explore this feature more for your particular projects. So I forgot to mention in this lesson, some important things to keep in mind about workflows are that workflows are associated. When I set a workflow, it does not change cases that have already been submitted. So if I've received 10 referrals last week and I set up my workflows now, those workflows don't get applied to the 10 cases that came in last week. They will only be applied to cases coming in the future. So if I set a workflow today, it applies to anything after I set the workflow. And that's how it's designed to work. That allows you to make changes and to know when that change will occur. So if I make a change or an adjustment to my workflows today, this is the date of the adjustment. Things in the past will operate according to whatever old logic you had applied, or no logic if there was nothing. And then things from now and tomorrow will happen according to the new logic. And that's just something to keep in mind, that there's no way to kind of go back easily and edit workflows. If you have made a mistake and you have workflows associated with data that you want removed, you'll have to contact us and we can help you with that. But generally speaking, this is why it's a good idea to test your workflows. And it's also a really good idea not to change them so much, because if you change them a lot, it can get confusing to know which logic is applied to which cases. So we kind of encourage you to use the workflows, but also use them very intentionally, plan out your usage of them, and also plan changes to them like very consciously, and even make note of when you've done that. Because, as I said, if you made a big process change, your data will start to change. And if you've forgotten that that's because of a workflow change you made, it can get very confusing. Okay. So that covers today's training. I'm going to wrap up by going back to Canessa's question.